So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the what, why, and how of digital strategy. I'm Lisa, your host for today, and I'll be making sure that everything works and that all of your questions get answered. There will be probably quite a few today, and we now have 324 live people. So yeah, quite a few. We've had an amazing response from you guys. We had 700 signups to this webinar. Obviously, the session will be recorded and shared with all of you afterwards. Digital strategy is such an important topic, and we really hope that you will find our presentation insightful, full of good takeaways, and you'll get a chance to ask your questions. For our webinar regulars, it's great to have you back. And for those of you joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. Like some of you, well, I am still working from home. We may have some connection issues. Jonathan and Mimi is in the office, but just bear with us if we have any drop. If you lose us at any point, just do let us know, and I'll do our very best to get back online at the quickest. I must also say that I'm overlooking a busy road in East London, so I hope that not too many cars will be roaring past. Before we delve into today's session, I just wanted to remind you all of our exciting free virtual conference, Be More Digital Fundraising Day, which is taking place on the 15th of October. It's going to be a jam-packed day of networking, learnings that will hopefully help you all navigate digital fundraising a bit better. We're going to hear from great organizations about their experience with digital fundraising, what's worked, what they've learned from COVID. So yeah, a great day. We've had over 1,000 people signed up already. So it's not too late if you want to register and if you want to get all the updates about the day and the agenda. Just have a look at our website. There might even be a link in the comments, but otherwise, just have a look there, and we look forward to seeing all of you. So now on to today's presentation. From the findings of the 2020 Charity Digital Skills Report, over half of nonprofit organizations still don't have a digital strategy in place. It's quite a high number. Some may be fearing, maybe they're lacking time or people or both to put in place a digital strategy that works. But fear not, because Jonathan Chevallier, our CEO here at Charity Digital, will be sharing helpful tips and guidance on why having a digital strategy is so important, but also, and more importantly, what and how you can do to create your own. This presentation was initially used for member organization of GLC, and it was such a big hit that we've decided to share it with all of you. And I think it was a good idea with 700 of you are signing up. So it is a recording, but of course, Jonathan will be answering your questions live at the end. Before I hand over to Jonathan, let me remind you that you can submit your questions throughout the webinar just by clicking on the Q&A button. It's either at the top or at the bottom of your screen, depends on your device. We may run over the hour, so feel free to dash at 2 p.m., but if you have to. But if you want to stay more, then we'll do our very best to answer all the questions anyway. So you're very welcome to stay. And as always, please do share with us your thoughts, your experience, your tips in the comment section, because it's always great to hear from one another and to learn from each other. If you have any problem hearing us throughout the webinar, just drop us a line again in the comment section. If we run out of time before your questions are answered, like I said, don't worry, it's all being recorded. We'll answer them offline and share everything along with the recording in the next few days. So don't worry. Without further ado, let me hand over to Jonathan on digital strategy. Thank you all.
Wonderful to be here today to talk to you about a subject that I'm really very passionate about. I've been working in the technology area for my entire career, and for most of that time, it's been focusing on strategy as well. And as I'm quite old now, that is quite a long time. So hopefully I've learned a few things over those years, and I'm going to aim to share some of that with you today. So what I'm talking about today, digital strategy, it's obviously a massive area overall. Repeated surveys of charities have shown that around 50% of charities actually typically don't have a digital strategy at any moment in time. And we've only got an hour today for me to do a presentation and to answer your questions as well. So we can really only look to scrape the surface today. But what I'm aiming to do is share a framework that I hope will be really useful and helpful for you. I should make you all aware that we have a digital guide on this, an e-guide, which is on our website. And what we will do when we share the slides of this presentation afterwards, we will also share the link to that. And that's got some more explanation of the subjects that I'm talking about. And it also points out a lot of other resources that I think you might find useful as well. So that's my kind of intro. Let's go on to the next slide now. So, obvious question, why do you need a digital strategy? Well, in one sense, you actually don't, because actually I would say that in the ideal world, you would have a strategy that fully includes digital. So your organization strategy will have digital running through it in a way that is totally integrated. So in that sense, you don't actually need one. Though in practice, if you may be developing one for the first time, it's actually quite useful to focus on it specifically as something that attaches to your main organization strategy, but is also separate as well. And that also gives you a chance to drill into a bit more detail than you would typically have in an overall organization strategy. So in the same way, you might actually have a marketing strategy that sits alongside your organization strategy and populates it with more detail, but is obviously consistent with it. But beyond that, other key reasons for having a digital strategy, well, I think particularly in this post-COVID age, but actually I think many organizations were seeing this over the last 10 years anyway, is this kind of steady increasing in demand for what we all do as our charities. Really hard to meet that, especially in an environment where maybe there are income challenges. We saw that through the kind of the austerity years. We're in recession now, so I think there's going to be more income challenges as well. And we've all seen many events being cancelled, which has contributed to that. Obviously, the digital world provides some wonderful opportunities for charities to communicate more through digital means, through social media, etc. So that's great. It's a really cheap way of communicating, but those digital spaces are also a lot more crowded as well. So it's harder to be noticed. And then in terms of how you respond to the needs of your beneficiaries, often there are competing needs, and you end up generating multiple options. So some of those options will focus maybe in the fundraising area, some in marketing, some will be about how you're providing your services, some might be about how you run your back office. You might want to be more efficient. So how do you actually set about reconciling those competing needs? How do you actually prioritize between them? How do you actually phase them at the end of the day? That's a real challenge. And of course, a digital strategy enables you to work through that process of prioritizing and phasing the developments for your organization. So those are all reasons why you could look at having a digital strategy. Let's talk a little bit about what I mean by digital strategy. Now, I don't want to teach anyone to suck eggs here at all, but I've done a very simple approach of let's just decompose that into the words strategy and digital. So this is actually the Wikipedia definition of strategy. So a general plan to achieve one or more long-term or overall goals under conditions of uncertainty. And within that, the process will set about developing goals, priorities, determining actions to achieve those goals, and then actually how we mobilize resources to execute those actions as well. So that's what I'm talking about when I say strategy. But what do we actually mean by digital as well? Because I think the digital part of digital strategy means many different things to different people. We actually take a very holistic view of this here at Charity Digital. So first of all, digital technology, so it means electronic tools, systems, devices, and resources that generate, store, or process data. Again, a Wikipedia definition. if you go to the Co-op, who did some good pioneering work on digital, they define digital as applying the culture, practices, processes, and technologies of the internet era to respond to people's raised expectations. So you see from that definition, it's gone suddenly way beyond specific technologies and tools, talking about culture, processes. So very, very different. And when we look at it from Charity Digital, we include all of those in how we look at digital strategy. In terms of the actual technologies as well, we think about infrastructure, we think about office productivity tools, be it Office or Google Suite, data storage, security, customer relationship management, fundraising, digital service delivery, and this massive range. But we believe a good digital strategy actually needs to consider all of these, because at different points for your organization, these areas can all become critical, and therefore if they've been ignored and forgotten about, that critical issue can then become a major constraint and actually stop you achieving what you want to do. Let's talk a little bit about why I think many organizations find producing a digital strategy hard. I've certainly seen some research which says that a number of charities don't actually have an organization strategy. So if you haven't got an organization strategy, it's going to be kind of difficult to produce a good digital strategy. So that's always going to be the start point. I'm going to assume today that everybody on this call does have an organization strategy. The second challenge is lack of knowledge of digital and technology. And again, this is a big challenge because digital and technology is such a big, big space. So it's actually super hard to get your head around all of it. And actually, I would say don't try and do that generally. Try and actually use assembled knowledge of different people to get there. But I think, if somebody's approaching this from this perspective of, oh, I need to know all about digital in great detail in order to do the strategy, they're going to find it hard. Then we've got the management of stakeholders. So even in a small charity, where maybe it's a really tight executive team and not that many employees, so you can actually get everybody within the charity very quickly bought into a strategy. There's still then the trustees, and maybe you're not seeing your trustees that often, but they need to be bought in. You can't just give them a strategy at the end of the day that they've never even seen before and expect them to sign that off without any time to buy into it, to understand it, and agree with it. Then we've got fear of change. Digital, both in terms of introduction of tools, but also in terms of changes to people's jobs, processes, that drives fear. I think we see that in many areas, and digital certainly brings that to the fore. Then we have culture. Cultures that are maybe both resistant to change and maybe just not correctly oriented in order to be able to make the most of digital technology. And I'll be touching on this again in more detail later. And I think one of the challenges for those organizations that maybe have become more digital in their culture, so they're kind of thinking more about iterating quickly, learning environments, all words we talk about in digital, sometimes they can lose track of the long term. So busy iterating that you forget that you need to hook into a long-term framework of strategic objectives as well. So we need to kind of constantly balance this short-term iteration and learning with this hooking into, well, what are the strategic goals of this organization? So those are all the things I think make digital strategy hard. They're also what make it super interesting, because it means there's so many different aspects to delve into. Now we've got this framework. It's one we developed ourselves, but kind of calling on quite a number of other different sources. I'm not saying this is the only way to do things. I'm not even saying it's the best way to do things. This is just a model that you might find useful to help produce a digital strategy. It appears as a linear model, the arrows point from left to right. And in one sense, you do need to be starting with organization, vision, and strategy to drive your digital strategy. And at the end, you need to produce some kind of plan and output. And therefore, that needs to be produced through some kind of project planning, budgeting, phasing process. So yes, the ends do kind of both need to happen. But you can kind of jump into a model like this at different points. You can certainly loop around between different stages as well. So you might start with a bit of work on the organisation side, jump into this stage of core planning activities, loop back into the organisation vision and update it with what you've learned from that activity. So very much it's not prescriptive. If you're starting from a relatively an advanced position, I wouldn't say you need to do all of these in detail. In actual fact, I'd say don't do them all in detail because it'll take too long. You know, a good strategic planning exercise isn't going to take you 6 months or a year, because the problem if it takes so long is you're not getting to actually doing anything. So actually producing a plan relatively quickly around maybe the areas you do understand well, and then putting in that plan, let's build out the detail in other areas later, is a good way to approach it. So that's the framework I'm going to be talking to today. We're going to dip into each of these in a bit more detail, and we'll have some time at the end to answer some questions. And do by means actually submit your questions at any point through this process. So let's start off by talking about this first stage of actually engaging with the strategy and the vision. I've got a couple of examples here, which are kind of evolutions of other organisations. I don't really want to identify the organisation specifically, but you'll probably recognise the types of things we're talking about here. So the first one, we've got an organisation that has a vision to eliminate poverty internationally. And the key actions there are acquire new and retain current supporters and facilitate long-term engagement in order to help us raise funds and influence governments and institutions that keep people in poverty. So this really calls out from a digital perspective. This is already calling out, you know, how can digital actually help fundraise more? How can digital help with the communications process in particular? And then the second line here is all around efficiencies in the head office, in order that we're maximising the use of the resources we've got. So this is starting to call out what type of technologies might enable the head office to operate more efficiently, and how might it connect more efficiently with the overseas branches. So a mixture maybe there of some back office processes and some communication technologies. The other example, find a cure and improve life for everyone suffering from disease X. So here the objective is to increase the reach that the charity has overall and the speed at which it's delivering its services, with the aim of reducing the number of people living with the condition and improving the lives of those people living with the condition. And then secondly, again, another efficiency objective there as well. So the first of the objectives kind of calls out more in the area of whole digital service delivery, maybe information provision, guidance and support, and the role that digital can provide there. So I think the real key thing here is spending the time to dig into the strategy and start to tease out the links to digital. They might not always be obvious. If they're not, it's not a problem, because the other stages in the process will focus us in on other areas of what the charity does in order to then identify the digital opportunities. But some of them might stand out early on. So if they do stand out early on, call them out and recognise them. The next stage I want to talk about is establishing digital baseline. And I've got 4 areas I'm going to touch on here. I'm going to touch on business processes. I'm going to talk about applications, as in software applications. I'm going to talk about infrastructure and digital maturity assessment. So this is a model of business processes. We've got 3 kind of key types of business processes here. So at the top of the chart, we've got the processes around the management and governance of the charity. And at the bottom, we've got what I'll call the supporting processes. So things that run finance, HR, those types of things. And then in the middle, we have the operational processes. And the operational processes really break down into 2 key categories. There is the service delivery, so the processes that are actually supporting the beneficiaries. And there are those processes which are focused more on the commercials. So things like how are we actually raising funds, how are we communicating to both our beneficiaries and to our supporters in the marketplace. If we're campaigning to change policy as well, how are we actually doing that? So the reason we put this chart in, this step of actually considering the business processes, is that, and again, your main strategic planning process might already have done this, they often do, is an opportunity to start to think about, you know, how the digital is linking to those business processes and what the opportunities for improvement might be. The next slide looks at business applications. It's a busy slide, there's a lot on it. As I say, we are circulating these slides afterwards, so you'll get plenty of time to look at it. The idea actually is, if you've done that whole business process mapping step, then you can actually start to think about, well, what are the applications that are then actually supporting each of those business processes? And you can start to ask questions about each of those applications. So you can look at its age. So is this an aging application that it's going to need replacing, really, because it's not really fit for purpose anymore? You can look at what's the forward route map for this application? Is it meeting the needs? If it's not meeting the needs, are there new things coming out that are going to meet the needs? How well supported is it as well? You know, is it internally supported? Is it supported by a third-party vendor? And coming out of this process of considering applications, we'd be looking to identify recommendations. So recommendations for where there are gaps, where there are things that should be retired, where there are things that should be replaced, where there are new things that should be introduced. Following on from the applications, we then look at infrastructure more. So I think the key point about infrastructure, when it works well, we just don't think about it. It's just there in the background doing its job. Infrastructure, when it works badly, is a real pain. We end up wasting lots of time. So purpose here again is to consider what is the infrastructure of the charity. Some of this will be the infrastructure which is actually supporting applications on the previous slide. It also looks at other areas like data storage. What are the people actually using as devices as well? All of that comes into here. And again, we're trying to look at the age, so the things that should be retired, the support, what the future life of those applications, that infrastructure is. So there's a nice logical flow, therefore, through kind of process applications and infrastructure. When we're looking at baselining, we then want to complement this with a view of digital maturity. I think some of you might be familiar with this model. This one actually came from the NCVO Digital Maturity Matrix. There are quite a number of different digital maturity tools, but this is one of the ones I really like. It complements quite nicely what I've been talking about with the processes, applications, and infrastructure, because there's a bit of overlap. It starts to bring in other areas as well. So it starts to consider the approach to communications, the approach to leadership, content as well. And if you're not familiar with this model, this tool, you'll know that, you won't know, but I'll now explain that it enables you both to map out where you would like your organization to be. So you answer a series of questions online, and from that it gives you a radar chart of where you'd like to be, which is the orange dotted line, and to map against that where you currently are as an organization, which is the solid bit in the middle. And from that, you have an opportunity to identify, well, what are the actual actions we might want to take to increase our maturity on any one of these 8 different dimensions. So really, by considering these tools, you have an opportunity to really start to identify quite a number of areas where you might make changes from a digital perspective in your organization. Our next stage we want to spend some time actually thinking about trends and opportunities. So what I've been talking to up to now has predominantly been internal. The trends and opportunities is actually looking outside the organization. And there's 2 predominant aspects. One is what's actually happening in technology, obviously relevant, and the other is demographic. So technology is obviously changing all the time, and that provides opportunities to actually change services, change fundraising approaches. So one of the big things was published in a report I looked at recently was the emergence of gaming, and gaming not just for gaming's sake, but gaming actually effectively as a form of social media where people are actually, communicating and working with their friends in a gaming environment, but then doing a lot more than just playing the game. And that seems to be a major emergence, which could be, I'm not saying it is, could be relevant to your charity. So here are some examples of other technology trends you might want to consider. And the aim is to say, what does this mean for us? Do we change our services? Are there new opportunities to communicate and fundraise as a result of these technologies? Can we introduce more efficiencies? When we look at the demographic side of things, we can look at, well, are the sizes of different subgroups changing dramatically? Obviously, we've got an aging population, so we know the number of people over the age of 65 is increasing dramatically. So what does that mean? We also know that the preference of groups changes. So young people today vastly prefer interacting through text to actually voice-based calls. So I know, for example, my kids hate picking up a telephone and talking to people, but they'll happily message. Now that's a demographic change that has really only come out over the last 10 years. So we need to be considering what are the implications of these changes for our services. That kind of takes me through, I guess, one set of planning and stimulus materials. If you remember back to the chart, I had 3 blocks. One looked at this thing called planning activities, one was looking at people and change, and one was looking at infrastructure, data and risk more. Talk about each of those in a bit more detail now. So planning activities, it's a bit of a placeholder to capture a number of different areas, which I think should be considered, which don't naturally fit elsewhere in the framework. There isn't time to talk about all of these in great detail, so I'll quickly go through. The guide has a lot more detail. So starting with reporting, I think the importance here is first of all focusing in what are the key strategic metrics that you want to be reporting on. So understanding what those are, and understanding how you're going to get to those metrics, and how often you're going to report on those. This is a subject that we're really into at Charity Digital. So our whole strategic framework then boils down into annual objectives, that then boil down into quarterly objectives across a whole range of different areas, which all of our employees are responsible for updating on a weekly basis. So we have distributed updating of all of those metrics, and we look at those as an organisation every week. Moving on to innovation, there's some hopefully useful models of innovation that we've got in the guide. So we look at kind of disruptive innovation, which uses maybe new business models. We look at radical innovation, which is using new competencies. And we look at innovation, which is basically more as-is innovation. So we're not introducing new competencies or new business models, but we're still innovating within our current context as well. So there's some stimulus material you can look at which talks about that. Project and product management, we're thinking about, particularly if you're a larger organisation, what are your standard approaches to delivering projects? And from a product management perspective, if you're delivering services digitally, it's sometimes useful to look at those as a product. So how do we actually evolve that product for the consumers of it? So what new features should we be introducing for them and when? That kind of overlaps with the subject of service delivery. And the real key here on service delivery is to make sure we're obviously putting the user at the center of those services. So we're being user-led in terms of those services we're providing. Moving on to the communications planning. So the key things in communications planning are considering really both our different audiences in sufficient detail, considering if we've got different teams in the organisation who are communicating at different times, but maybe overlapping on subject area, how we actually plan those communications so that they reinforce each other, rather than kind of seem to hit the audiences with lots of different content at different times, which maybe don't reinforce each other. And I certainly know of one organisation when they were running their kind of year-end campaign going into December, that they were actually able to double the revenue that they got from that fundraising campaign as a result of much better communications planning across the organisation. Audience insight, which should be key to driving the communications planning. So how are we getting those insights? You know, are we getting those through Google Analytics? How are we using, if we've got a CRM system, how are we using that? Are we looking at the fundraising data that we're getting in? Are we doing any surveys? So there's a whole range of different ways in which we might actually consider how we build those audience insights. And then finally, actually planning the content that we're putting in front of those audiences in order to achieve the type of outcome that we might want. So just quickly moving on, you know, this is the model that we've actually got in the guide as a content planning. Obviously, content planning in itself could, we've actually done a webinar on this that took a whole session, but this just follows a cycle of looking at, you know, what is the organisation trying to achieve? So if it's trying to eliminate a certain condition or alleviate the suffering of the people with the condition, identifying that, evidencing that condition to supporters so that they're more eager to contribute and support that cause. So bringing things like case studies there. What's the solution we're providing? The case study can be expanded. And actually, what do we want people to do at the end of the day? So very, very quick touch on that from a content planning perspective. I want to spend a bit more time on people and change. I think, so one of the challenges some organisations have had in the past when maybe they've viewed digital strategy planning as a more technical activity is that this aspect can get really overlooked, and if this aspect gets overlooked, you're not going to achieve what you want overall at the end of the day. It's certainly going to hold you back. So the types of areas that we'd be looking to consider in the people and change section. Certainly, what is the current staff experience of the digital tools and technologies that are being used within the organisation? Let's make sure that we're actually taking their input and we're understanding their thoughts, feelings, and opinions as we shape that digital strategy. Digital leadership is incredibly important to me. And one of the subjects I like to talk about is the difference between what I will call expert digital leadership and empowering and coaching digital leadership. So the former relies on someone or people who know digital in great detail and great depth, and they lead through that expert knowledge. The latter, which is focused more on empowering and enabling, really says that the leader doesn't need to be any kind of expert in the digital technologies here. What they will do is they will work with the people who are the experts to bring that knowledge to the fore, and they will ensure that other people in the organisation get involved, that they understand what they need to know. They will remove roadblocks that might exist. They will take the difficult decisions as well. So one of the difficult decisions an organisation might hit, if it doesn't have the right skills, it might actually need to reshape its workforce, which could mean letting some people go and employing some new people. And that tends to be fairly unusual. You know, most of the time you can actually evolve your workforce okay, but sometimes difficult decisions do need to be made. And part of leadership is making those difficult decisions and seeing that they're implemented. So that digital leadership is really, really important. Quite a number of different areas within culture to consider. So first of all, we've got creating the right motivation. So creating an environment within the organisation in which people want to embrace digital rather than resist it. Moving on from there, we've got the whole how are we actually empowering people so that they can then actually take on the tasks and activities they need to do. How are we getting them to collaborate with each other? Because a lot of digital initiatives actually require people in different teams to collaborate. So actually creating a culture in which people will collaborate. I touched on this theme of learning and iteration. So one of the great things with where technology is now is a lot of changes can be actually technically implemented quite quickly, which provides a great opportunity to try things out, maybe on a small scale to start with, see what works, learn from that and build on it. But obviously, kind of creating that environment where it's all right to try, experiment, fail sometimes, and learn from that. That's a big culture change for a lot of organisations. So that needs to be led. There's obviously a join up here for the whole digital leadership theme again. Digital capacity. So what capabilities do we have within the organisation to support digital, and how many people have those capabilities is obviously critical, because if we don't have the capacity, we're not going to be able to introduce any type of change. So we need to both understand that capacity, understand what capacity we might need, and work out how we're going to get it. Now, part of getting it might be we can work with third parties, and we might contract them to do some things, particularly early on, and then we might transition some of those skills into the organisation over time. It's also worth considering here, are we looking at a centralised approach where all the digital skills sit in the one team in the middle? Are we looking at what they call a hub and spokes model, where we've got a smallish team in the middle, but then capabilities distributed out to teams across the organisation, or a fully decentralised model where there's no capability in the middle and all the capability sits in teams distributed across the organisation? I'm not saying any one of those models is right or wrong. Different models are actually tend to be right at different points in time. So it's a matter of working out which of those is going to work for you. Learning and development then is obviously one key way of addressing gaps that there are within the capacity overall. So where you have existing skills mismatches, how can you actually set about developing and evolving the skills of the current workforce in order to fill those gaps? And sometimes that's going to need recruitment as well, to bring in skills that can't easily or can't be quickly enough developed in-house. And I think one of the key things here then is to be realistic in terms of budgeting for those resources. They might cost more than existing resources, and if you don't budget for it accordingly, you won't be able to get those resources. And if the strategy says you need those resources, you need them. So a whole bundle of things there under people and change. It's a really, really deep topic. I've done a whistle-stop tour here, but the aim is, to present a framework which lets you consider all of these different aspects and balance them out. So the last of those three key detailed planning blocks is technology, risk and data. I've touched on infrastructure already. So the importance here is really making sure that, first of all, people in the organisation have the right, people have the right devices to be able to do their jobs. Bandwidth can be critically important as well. So if we become more digital within our organisation, we might need a lot more internet bandwidth. If we haven't planned for that, then that becomes a constraint, particularly if we're maybe looking at people who are mobile out in the field, becoming more enabled. They need both the devices and the communications to be able to work with the systems. Data. This tends to become more of an issue as people move along the maturity curve. So people start off from, relatively few systems. They'll then maybe use a number of discrete applications to fulfill key activities. But those systems then quickly become islands of data that don't easily share information between themselves, which makes it really hard to kind of understand if you're looking, trying to form a consolidated view of a supporter or a beneficiary. It's really hard to form that view, and people end up doing things like manually moving data around, and it just becomes really, really time consuming. So it's actually at certain points in the digital strategic planning process, it's really important just to stand back and say, how are we actually managing data as a whole? And actually, do we need to actually spend some money on pulling this data together? It's something we've recently done in Charity Digital. We introduced a new digital platform in February, and one of the big objectives there was to enable us to have a lot more integrated data, because we were spending a lot of time manually cranking processes. Security, incredibly important, and again, subject that we've done many webinars on, both considering the security, our applications up to date. We obviously had Windows 7 went out of date earlier this year. That meant it became unsupported. Organizations that are still running on Windows 7 therefore have critical security risks within them. What software are you putting on the endpoint, on the desktop, then to protect that? Are you using any technologies to monitor for breaches, to monitor for other risks as well? So we've recently been doing some work with a company called Scurio, who monitor data on the dark web to try and anticipate some potential risks. And then ethics. I think two aspects of ethics really coming to the fore. Artificial intelligence and algorithms, certainly. Algorithms are a real dirty word at the moment as a result of the government GCSEs and A-levels, where there was a fairly crass algorithm applied to achieve a top-level kind of comparability of results to previous years. Obviously, the impact of that was totally ignored the capability of individuals, and ignored cohort performances, all types of considerations that were just ignored, and that I would say was actually deeply unethical at the end of the day. So I think kind of making sure when you're introducing technologies, particularly if you're introducing any algorithms within those technologies, that they're ethical is really important. Also, if we're becoming more digital, we need to think about the people who can't use those services, maybe because they're not online, and make sure we're not locking those people out. So that's another really important aspect of ethics. Right, we're nearly at the end now, then we'll open up for questions. If you followed these previous stages, what you will have done is you will have generated a large amount of potential actions, a large amount of potential projects. So the challenge now becomes, well, what's the priority? Which should we progress first, and in what order? And I'd recommend a framework that looks something like this. So on one axis, I consider impact. So impact can be both impact on beneficiaries and impact on funding and sustainability as well, because all of those things join together. So impact on one axis and cost and resource on the other, with the aim that we want to prioritize those things which are high impact and low cost. Some of the higher impact things, though, do often tend to cost a bit more, so they will become strategic investments. Things that are low impact and high cost, we should absolutely just ignore those. And then there'll be areas which can be tactically deployed because they're medium impact but low cost. And often those areas can be quite good to do in the short term, particularly if you're trying to get some momentum into a digital program, because you can deploy them quickly, you can show some positive results, and that kind of can build more buy-in and commitment. So the whole aim here is to test each of the areas, the potential projects we've developed against the matrix such as this, and to prioritize as a result of that, and then start to phase. And the next slide, I've got an example of how we might turn all of these areas I've been talking about into a digital strategic plan. It follows those three key blocks I talked about, so planning activities, people and change, technology, data and risk, and it follows them out over 3 years, which kind of gives a nice flow. One of the temptations is always to try and cram everything into year 1, and you end up with nothing in year 2 and year 3. So it's important to push some of those areas back in time, and it's okay to have less in the later years, because as you move through, you'll obviously identify new things you want to do as a result of the learning that you get. And the final slide, before I open up for questions, just want to consider a few other key subjects. So stakeholder management, I touched on it at the outset. It's obviously incredibly important. So the key thing, first of all, is to try and involve your stakeholders through the process. a framework such as I've described would actually be really hard for one person to do on their own anyway. So maybe, there's some people, and change could be devolved to somebody with more of an HR orientation to look at that. The planning activities, the marketing and fundraising, people are going to have a big role to play in that one as well. And then the kind of the infrastructure, the more technical people can pull that up. So both working to bring people into the planning process all the way along is really important. You can use the maturity matrix approach to actually get different people involved in the assessment as well. And you could get the board to do that. So the key is involve people through the process, including the board, so that they're not signing something off at the end that is totally a surprise to them. The strategy should be constantly refreshed in the light of experience. So the days of the strategy that is written and sits on the shelf, kind of ignored and is then looked at once a year to update it, those are gone. We should be learning from our experiences and actually not being afraid to change and tune certain areas. If we've done the exercise well, the broad strategic direction will probably be correct and not change dramatically, but some of the details of the actions and the priorities can change from that learning. Big point is not to boil the ocean at the start. I have shared with you a framework that is pretty demanding, pretty challenging to complete all of that. If you're starting at an earlier stage, don't try and do all of that in one go. Pick off the areas that are easier to do, form a plan around those, and then just put on the plan that you're going to do some of the other areas over the coming year and fill those out, so that the next iteration you'll have a fuller plan. And again, linked to that, don't seek perfection. There is no perfection in this. We're always dealing with unknowns and uncertainties. So good enough will do. Let's get a plan that is good enough to move forward on, because we're going to change it. We're going to iterate it anyway. And the big thing to bear in mind is, the actions should always link back to the strategic priorities. If we're linking to the strategic priorities, then even though some of the details will turn out wrong, we'll learn they're wrong, but as long as we're broadly focusing on the strategic priorities, we will move in the right direction, and we will have a digital strategy that better supports our organization and increases our impact and sustainability, which is what I think we're all about at the end of the day. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour there. I'll very quickly go to questions now. I've overran a little bit in my presentation, for which I apologise, but let's open up now.
Brilliant. Well, that's the end of our session about digital strategy, and thank you all so much for listening. The recording slide and all resources will be shared with you next week, and we will also make sure that the slides are more accessible in terms of color contrast. I can see that we've already got some questions in the Q&A tab, so I will start with the first one. Don't forget that you can submit or upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up next to each questions, and at any time. So now on to the first question from somebody who put the question very early. My organization does have a business strategy, and some of our processes are digital, but we lack a digital strategy. So where do you suggest we start? What are the first things we need to do?
So the first things to do are really to focus in on what is the organisation strategy. If the digital strategy isn't linking to that organisation strategy, then your digital activity is focused in the wrong area. So very much I would go to the organisation strategy, seek to understand that, and to start to think through how digital supports that. That's definitely a strong start point. I think also understanding the baseline is really important as well. So, where things are currently, because it's hard to understand how to move forward towards what you're aiming to get to if you don't have some sense of where you are currently as well. So I'd probably put those two things together, and just doing those, you'll actually start to identify things you could do and prioritize, and then you can add in the other elements. Obviously, I've talked about a very broad framework here. You can start to add in other elements of the framework to build out that strategy in more detail and refine it from there.
Brilliant. Now on to the next one. Oh, let me see if I can turn up my mic on a bit. I've been told I might not be heard. Another question from, well, anonymous. Have started as the first staff member at a newish charity. We've got various digital stuff going on, website development, including members area, social media contract with an agency, planned move to Google Suite, but no overarching digital strategy. So it'd be great to be offered a template or key headings to help me pull together a strategy quickly.
So I think I haven't developed kind of like a written template that you can fill in, but if you took the planning framework slide that I shared early on, which identified all of the different blocks. So, you know, it had the organization strategy, it had the digital purpose, the baselining, trends and opportunities, planning activities, etc., etc. You could just use those as your headings in actual fact at the end of the day. And you'll remember that from the slide at the end where I showed a sample plan, I then actually split that plan out. So I kind of considered my people and change stream separate from my planning activities stream, which was also then separate to my stream, which was looking more at the infrastructure, the data, the ethics, and the risk. And I think it's quite useful to actually think in those ways, because one of the tendencies, I think it's a tendency of all of us, is we tend to focus in on our area of most comfort. So, you know, someone who's from a deeper technical background might veer away from the people change aspects, which are really, really important at the end of the day, because if you haven't got the right people working in the right way, your digital strategy will fail. So actually thinking about those three streams separately and populating those is very worthwhile as well.
That's great. Thank you. On to the next one. Considering the role of trustees in driving strategy, including digital, are there any reflection on the idea of appointing a dedicated digital trustee versus integrating those responsibilities across all trustees? And that's a question from Duane Farrell.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think the idea of appointing digital trustees has been a very popular idea in recent times, predominantly because I think quite a number of charities had boards which maybe lacked any digital awareness or skills at all. So this kind of approach of, well, let's go and get at least one person by having a dedicated digital trustee, that was then proposed as a step forward. Personally, I would say if you can have those skills more distributed, it's even better. So I'm not saying it's wrong to have a digital trustee, but if you can have multiple people who've actually got a digital perspective, that's useful. And this kind of plays to the fact that also digital it's kind of too big a topic for one person to have their head around all of it. So I mean, we actually at Charity Digital, we recently had a lot of trustee changes because we introduced maximum terms. And so we actually sat down and said, what skills do we want all of these people to have? And I wanted to have some people who had digital marketing skills. I wanted to have some people who had digital service delivery skills. I wanted some people to have deeper techie skills as well. So I actually approached it in that way and was really pleased to actually then build out the board in that way. So I think it's definitely worth thinking in that way and thinking about digital as broadly as you can. There's also another aspect actually kind of behind this question as well, which is balancing the strategy role of the board with the strategy role of the executive as well. And I think the challenge here is, you know, we've looked at a really big framework here with a lot of work in it. Trustees only have a limited amount of time that they can give at the end of the day, so they're not going to be able to populate, unless you're very lucky and have someone with a lot of spare time, they're not going to be able to populate the whole of this type of framework for you. So a lot of that work is going to have to be done more within the charity by the executive and other members of staff that they choose to involve as well. But then that needs to be brought back to the board who approve it. And it's sensible to have these touch points with them. And good trustees with digital awareness will contribute great ideas, that they'll ask really good questions. So, have you properly considered your beneficiary needs in this area? And sometimes those really short but deeply insightful questions move you forward a massive amount. So kind of doing the detail work outside, but involving the trustees enough that they can bring that expertise, kind of critical focus, and ask the right questions and provide appropriate advice. That's really helpful as well. So important to get the balance there, but I definitely encourage to try and get your breadth of digital skills on the board if you can, but if you can only get one, it's still a great place to start.
That's really great. Thank you. Next question from John Beaton. Where does digital accessibility or inclusive design come into the model?
Yes, that's again, that's a really great question. So obviously this is strategy at the end of the day. So actually strategy doesn't design any of the detailed deliverables at the end of the day, but it does identify priorities, and it will identify, I guess, key requirements. And I'd say there's two areas therefore within which the strategy should be considering accessibility. Within planning activities, there's service delivery in there, and being user-led in service delivery. So when we're considering what our users need, we should be providing digital solutions that they find accessible. And that therefore means there might be some differences for different communities, because if you're dealing with a set of beneficiaries with a very specific set of requirements, maybe certain disabilities, then you might have to push much further into your design to ensure that they're incorporated and that it's kind of optimized just for their community. The second area I'd say needs to be considered in is ethics as well. So if I'm a charity that's supporting a very wide user base, or my objective is to support a wide user base, how ethical is it if we're then excluding a significant subset of that base by not being inclusive? So for me, it comes into two areas. What are the user needs? And also thinking about how are we designing, how are we being ethical in terms of how we're enabling people to access what we do. And I actually have two perspectives on this as well. So accessibility is one. The other part is actually people who are excluded for economic reasons. So some people do not have the technology to be able to access certain types of application. So for those people, we should always be thinking about how we're providing our services so they can still work with us. So maybe that they can use text on a phone, but they haven't got a smartphone, for example. They haven't got a data plan. So do you have text-based services? Still having some voice-based services. All of that is really important. There's clear overlap there in terms of economic exclusion and what I call more physical accessibility as well.
Absolutely. Just a little mention, we are going to, well, we're past 2 p.m. now. We will be carrying on for a little while because we have still a few questions, but feel free to jump off if you need to. And we thank you very much for attending today's session. And just a quick mention as well, we will be releasing one of our last conference recordings about cybersecurity with the amazing Cub Cleveland Davis from the National Cybersecurity Center. So that's next Tuesday. And for our regular webinar attendees, we'll have the fantastic teams from Sage Intact on September 24th at 4 p.m. And they will be sharing with us some insights on easy finance for nonprofit. So just wanted to highlight that as well, for those of you who are regular, and for newcomers as well. So now we'll go back to a couple more questions. So now the next question we have, do you have any tips for very small organizations with one or none paid members of staff and a large number of older volunteers?
Yes, so I'm trying to think behind this question. So I think there's a couple of aspects here. So I'm assuming one is if I don't have much resource, and that resource isn't very digital, how do I actually move forward my digital strategy? So I think you can definitely look at, there's a number of services which provide advice and guidance here, which would be really useful to tap into. So there's the Digital Candle, which is able to provide a mentoring service. So that can be very useful. And then you could actually look for specific digital volunteers as well to help support the projects that you might want to progress and to help you in this strategy planning exercise. So there are, so I mentioned REACH, the CITA provide a similar service as well. One of the, well, we're also doing more work to kind of work out, how we can actually take this down to the next level of detail. Not specifically targeted on very small charities, more medium-sized at the moment. We've been recently running a multi, it's all virtually delivered, but a multi session program running over 6 weeks to help people build out that digital strategy, kind of handheld them through it. So there's one aspect. If the reference to the older people was more kind of like, well, what should I do to meet their needs? If they're older and they're not very digital, then you need to actually consider, how do I make these services very simple and easy for them to access if you're providing them digitally? Because they haven't got skills, they're not going to be able to navigate things that are very complex. Though having said that, because I don't want to sound as though I'm being patronising to older people at all, and I'm kind of rapidly getting to be part of that community myself. I think we've actually seen quite a number of, and I'm kind of thinking about the post 65. I'm not quite at that stage yet. The post 65 community, we've actually seen some of those people develop very rapidly their digital skills through lockdown, as they've been forced to go onto Zoom to talk to their grandchildren and things like that. They've actually found it really much easier than they've thought. So some of that has just been kind of overcoming barriers to change, and that community, I think, as a whole, has actually started to get more comfortable. But you do still need to reach out to them, understand what people are comfortable with, understand what they're prepared to do, experiment in small ways. So if you're not sure whether people are going to take up a new digital service, don't put lots and lots of money into it. Try something out that's small scale, see what the take up is on that, so where there's much take up, what type of feedback you get, and then from there decide what to do next. So I've kind of answered two questions in one there, because I wasn't kind of sure what direction the person wanted me to go in, so I thought I should do both.
Yeah, that's great. And then Ellie had quite a similar question. Where should small charities with no digital expertise or budget focus their effort? So if you wanted to.
Okay, so the big question here is, what is your top priority as a charity? Because I assume that you'll be spending some money somewhere in your organisation, or some time, and time is money, trying to achieve that objective. So look at that objective and just start to think about, how could digital support better the achievement of that objective, and put some time, see if you can find some limited budget, to then progress something to help you achieve that objective. If that is then successful, then you kind of have the proof that you should do more. And this is kind of thing about strategy at the end of the day. Good strategy recognizes that as organizations, we do sometimes have to invest in certain areas, and investing in one area means not investing in another area. So strategy processes to enable us to kind of balance those priorities at the end of the day and decide what we should do, and then follow those through, but taking the learning, so do a small investment, see if it works. If it does, you can justify more. If it wasn't, reflect on why not. Did you do it wrong, or you're in the wrong area? There's lots of potential aspects to explore.
Great, thank you. We've had a request from a member of the audience with regards to your previous answer, you had a couple of recommendations for mentoring and support. I think you mentioned Digital Candle, and was there another one that
Yeah,
you
yeah,
recall?
Reach Volunteering
Reach, yeah,
and CITA, CITA.
yeah,
Stands for the, I think it's Charity IT Association. So they have a volunteering program as well. So these are all ways to access skilled resources at zero or very low cost.
very low cost, yeah, and the platform is Reach Volunteering. So on to the next question from Sam Lines. We're about to start looking at our digital strategy. But as an organization, we do feel like we are quite digital focused. What approaches would you suggest to get staff, non-management, trustee, board level, all of them involved and on board with digital strategy from the start? And most importantly, allow people to have a voice in the direction.
Yes. So one of the great ways to start off is actually to get them to do a digital maturity assessment. So use something like the NCBO tool. Um, it's designed to support multiple people from the same organization putting their input in. So you could actually do that and look at the results that come back, and then actually use the results that come back as the basis of a discussion with some of these different groups. You probably wouldn't want to handle all of those groups at once, so you could then have sessions, and it depends on the size of your organization. So you could definitely have a session with all your trustees to look at the results. If you're a large organization, you can't do it with your staff, so you need to break them down into subgroups, but start to explore in that way. If you're also a larger organization, I talked about this in terms of working through the different areas of the framework, delegate working on different parts of that framework to different subgroups. So the people who have the interest in the whole software aspects of change, get them working on that area, get the more marketing communications community working through the aspects which we cover under planning activities. So I think that's a good model. And have points at which you pull together where those people have got to, and share that across groups as well, so that there's kind of parallel streams are joined together in some way.
Super. And I guess that answers as well June's next questions, who was asking whether the digital maturity matrix can be completed with multiple
Yes,
stakeholders.
yes, it can.
So that's great. Another question. Will you advise on how to pull together a digital strategy if your organization don't have a clear business strategy? I work for a cathedral, and there is a business strategy for sightseeing, but also quite a woolly strategy for the mission. Any ideas when the strategy does really have a clear outcome?
Okay, so I think there's two ways to take this forward. Um, if there really is a complete absence of strategy, then I would actually go and work on that problem first, or get people who can solve that problem to work on it. Because otherwise, you're just unfocused with anything you do digitally. It might help, but it's just not. It's not going to be strategic, whatever you do in that area, because it's just going to be based on disconnected ideas and concepts. So getting back into that org strategy is key, and I'd say do that first. Now, an example I've been given here, we do have a strategy for one part of the organisation, and I think this does provide a potential way of moving forward. So rather than saying, well, we can't do anything at all until some organisation strategy is clarified, you can say, well, there's a good strategy in this part of the organization. Let's work out how digital supports that part of the organization strategy, and let's work that through and identify some clear actions that can then be taken forward, and then actually do them. That way, you're doing a couple of things. One, you're actually starting to demonstrate, well, you're actually starting to learn how to develop and implement a digital strategy, and you're doing it on a scale that's maybe easier to get your arms around than the whole organization. Also, hopefully you can demonstrate some great results from doing this, which might then encourage the organisation more broadly to think more strategically and engage in that way.
Okay, great. Over to the next question from Clarissa. What are your thoughts on the pros and cons of developing digital skills in-house versus outsourcing to agencies?
Yeah, so there's no really, certainly long term, no right and wrong answer here. I know that many people start by using an outside agency, and I think if you have very low levels of skills internally, that's a good approach, because it enables you to kind of work through the strategy process and move into some kind of implementation and start to build that momentum from implementation, demonstrating results. So that's really good. But whether you want to continue with that model longer term is another question. You know, using entirely agency resource tends to be more expensive longer term than having in-house resource. At the same time, it takes time and effort to build in-house resource, and maybe if you don't need that resource all the time, it's not cost effective to have it sitting around internally. So that's kind of why I say there's not a right and wrong answer. And so for some people it'll be, yeah, we're going to continue with agency resource. For others it's kind of like, we want to do most of this with in-house, but maybe when we've got something really big, we'll use some agency resource. And some people might operate on a mixed model. I mean, we kind of do that at Charity Digital. So we actually use a platform called, from a company called Afino. They built that platform and they manage it for us, and they do the bigger, harder work. But then we do quite a lot of deployment within that platform, and our skills are actually building up over time, so we're able to do more ourselves. But we won't ever move to a position where we're doing it all. We'll continue with that mixed model. But I say the answer kind of depends on your organisation, and it's probably going to be driven by what is actually in the strategy in terms of what you're trying to implement, which is why you need to think about the three streams together rather than independently.
Absolutely. And actually, coming back on the sustainability point, we'll be ending with this question from June Bedders. Sustainability is an important aspect, not mentioned maybe. How can charities ensure their digital strategy does ensure they establish sustainable growth approaches to their digital adoption?
Yes, I'm just digesting all of that. So how can charities ensure their digital strategy ensures they establish sustainable growth approaches to their digital adoption? Yeah, a couple of aspects again in this. So yes, I think one aspect is how much do you make your digital strategy focus on sustainability, and the other aspect is how is your digital sustainable in itself. So I'll try and answer both aspects. So if you think back to when I was talking about organisation strategy, that should be able to identify how we're balancing the effort and the resources that we're putting into kind of the service delivery, you know, which is kind of why we exist at the end of the day. You know, if we're not having impact for our beneficiaries, then we shouldn't be here. But maybe if the finances of the organisation are particularly stretched, you know, the resources are low, then sustainability kind of overtakes that as an issue, because if that issue isn't fixed, then the charity will cease to exist and no one will be benefiting. And actually I throw risk in as the third area as well, because if we ignore risk and something unexpected happens, then that can sink us as a charity. So going back to the organisation strategy apart, the organisation needs to kind of look at the balance of these things and say, you know, how much are we able to just focus on this stage at the delivery services to the beneficiaries? How much are we having to put more focus on sustainability, so that is growing our income, maybe reducing costs, so increasing efficiency as well. So that's a really important part from the front end of the strategy process, and that'll obviously flow through into relevant digital actions. So that's one angle on the answer. If it was more the how is my digital sustainable, um, for me, if um, if the digital activity is tightly tied into the organization strategy and it is delivering results, then that should provide all the evidence that is required to say that, you know, the activities that have been undertaken should continue to be supported financially by the charity. So that makes that sustainable. Part of sustainability also is, somebody leaves is always a critical issue. So you've got to recruit someone new to replace them. If the services that they're supporting, again, are demonstrating their value to the organisation, then the case to replace that person should be very clear as well. So I think in both cases, for me, the answer goes back to this really tight linkage into helping the organisation to achieve its strategy at a higher level.
Absolutely. And well, thanks very much for all of your answers, Jonathan's. I think that's all we're going to have time for today, because it's almost 20 past now. Thank you all so much for staying on and for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this session. We will be sharing the recording, the slides, and all the other resources via email next week. We will also upload that to the website, so you're welcome to coming back to it, share with your colleagues, and have some time to take in all the information. As soon as you will leave the session, you will have a pop-up window which will appear straight away in your browser, and that's basically the feedback. So we would love it if you could leave us your comment and feedback on this session, as we hope we really enjoyed it, so that we know, if what we provide to you is of help and assistance. So yes, well, thanks very much for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed the session, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, Jonathan.